When 25-year-old Victoria Sterling looked her 71-year-old billionaire husband in the eyes and confessed, "I only married you for the inheritance," she expected anger, hurt, maybe even divorce papers. What she didn't expect was for him to smile and say, "I know. And I've been waiting 18 months for you to tell me the truth." What happened next would change both their lives forever. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of the Blackwood Estate as Victoria Sterling paced nervously in the grand library. At 25, she had grown accustomed to luxury over the past 18 months, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of her deception had become unbearable. 18 months ago, Victoria's world was crumbling. A struggling art history graduate from Baltimore, she was drowning in student loans while working 3 part-time jobs just to afford her tiny studio apartment. Her mother's cancer treatments were draining their family savings faster than she could earn money, and her younger brother, Marcus, was about to drop out of his engineering program at Johns Hopkins due to unpaid tuition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria had applied for every scholarship, every grant, every opportunity she could find. Nothing worked. The medical bills mounted daily, eviction notices piled up, and her family was depending on her to find a miracle. She was brilliant, beautiful, and most importantly, desperate enough to consider the unthinkable. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday evening at the Metropolitan Art Gallery in Baltimore. Victoria was working as a part-time docent, giving tours to wealthy patrons, when she met him. Alexander Blackwood, 71, tech billionaire worth $3.2 billion, and one of the most influential men on the East Coast. He had approached her after her passionate explanation of a Caravaggio painting, his steel-gray eyes showing genuine interest not just in the art, but in her knowledge and enthusiasm. "You have a remarkable understanding of chiaroscuro," Alexander had said, his voice cultured and warm despite his intimidating reputation. "Most people see pretty pictures. You see the artist's soul." Victoria had been struck by his intelligence, his refined manner, and most dangerously, by the way he seemed to really see her, as more than just another struggling graduate student. When he asked her to dinner to discuss Renaissance art, she said yes, telling herself it was purely professional. That first dinner led to another, then another. Alexander was charming, sophisticated, and surprisingly lonely despite his vast wealth. He spoke of his late wife Margaret, who had died 5 years earlier, and how empty his sprawling mansion felt. Victoria found herself genuinely enjoying his company, even as a darker plan began forming in her mind. Alexander owned tech companies across 3 continents, had been featured on Forbes' most eligible bachelors over 70, and lived in a world Victoria had only dreamed of. When he began showering her with expensive gifts paying for her mother's treatments, covering Marcus's tuition, moving her into a luxury apartment, Victoria told herself she was simply accepting help from a generous friend. But she knew better. She saw how Alexander looked at her, heard the loneliness in his voice when he spoke of his empty estate. She understood exactly what he wanted: companionship, someone to fill the void his late wife had left behind. When Alexander proposed after only 6 months of courtship, Victoria saw her answer to every prayer and every problem. The engagement ring was worth more than her family's annual income, and the prenuptial agreement promised her financial security beyond her wildest dreams. She said yes, knowing exactly why she was doing it, and telling herself that a marriage of convenience to a man nearing the end of his life was a victimless crime. After all, Alexander was getting companionship, and she was saving her family from financial ruin. It seemed like a fair exchange. The wedding was elegant but small, held at the estate with only close friends and family present. Victoria played the part of the loving young bride perfectly, while internally calculating how long she would need to maintain the charade. For a year and a half, Victoria lived in luxury she had never imagined. The Blackwood Estate was a 50-room mansion in the hills of Maryland, complete with staff, art collections, and every comfort money could provide. Alexander was kind, generous, and genuinely seemed to care for her well-being, but the guilt was eating her alive. Alexander would look at her with such genuine affection, speak of their future together, and make plans that extended far beyond what his age might realistically allow. Victoria found herself caring for him more than she had anticipated, which only made her deception feel more cruel. Tonight, as Alexander sat reading in his favorite leather chair, Victoria realized she couldn't continue the lie any longer. The man deserved to know the truth about why she had married him. He deserved honesty, even if it meant losing everything she had gained. Taking a deep breath, Victoria approached her husband, her heart pounding with fear and determination. She had no idea that Alexander Blackwood was far more perceptive than she realized, and that he had been quietly watching, waiting, and planning something that would turn her entire world upside down. The confession she was about to make would be just the beginning of a story that neither of them could have predicted. Victoria's single quotes as hands trembled as she approached Alexander's reading chair. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, each note echoing through the vast library like a countdown to her judgment. Alexander looked up from his leather-bound book, a biography of Carnegie, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers with that familiar warmth that made her guilt burn even deeper. "Alexander," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you long ago." He set down his book carefully, giving her his full attention. "Of course, my dear. What's troubling you?" Victoria took a shaky breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I only married you for the inheritance." The words hung in the air between them like a confession in a cathedral. Victoria braced herself for the explosion of anger, the hurt, the betrayal she was certain would follow. Instead, Alexander did something completely unexpected. He smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a sarcastic smirk, but a genuine, almost relieved smile that reached his eyes. "I know," he said softly, leaning back in his chair. "And I've been waiting 18 months for you to tell me the truth." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. Her legs weakened, and she gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. You knew?" Alexander chuckled, a sound both gentle and unsettling. "Victoria, my dear, I didn't become a billionaire by being naive about people's motivations. Did you really think I didn't notice the timing of our meeting? A desperate young woman, drowning in debt, suddenly appearing in my life just when I was at my most vulnerable and lonely? But you seemed so happy. You acted like you loved me," Victoria stammered, her carefully constructed world crashing down around her. "Oh, but I do love you," Alexander said, standing and walking toward the massive window overlooking the estate grounds. "That's what makes this so interesting." Alexander turned back to face her, his expression shifting from gentle amusement to something more calculating. "You see, Victoria, you weren't the only one with a plan. While you were plotting to marry me for my money, I was conducting my own little experiment." Victoria's throat went dry. "What kind of experiment?" "I wanted to see if someone could genuinely come to care for me, even if their initial motives were purely financial. I wanted to know if love could grow from deception, if authenticity could emerge from pretense." His voice carried a hint of scientific curiosity that chilled her. "You mean this was all a test?" Alexander moved closer, his presence suddenly feeling more imposing than comforting. "Not just a test, my dear. A very expensive, very elaborate psychological study. See, after Margaret died, I realized I had spent my entire life wondering if people cared about me or my money. I decided to find out definitively." "I know everything, Victoria," Alexander continued, his tone matter of fact. I know about your mother's cancer diagnosis 3 weeks before we met. I know about Marcus's tuition crisis. I know about the eviction. Notice you received the day after our first dinner. I even know about the Google searches you did on my net worth and life expectancy. Victoria felt sick. You were watching me? I was protecting my investment, he replied coolly. You'd be surprised how thorough a background check can be when money is no object. Private investigators, financial analysts, even psychological profiles. I knew exactly who you were before I asked you to that first dinner. But here's what's fascinating, Alexander said, settling back into his chair as if discussing the weather. Somewhere along the way, you started to actually care. I saw it in the way you worried when I caught that cold last winter. I heard it in your voice when you called to check on me during my business trips. You began to feel guilty about your deception, which means you developed genuine feelings. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. How can you be so calm about this? I lied to you. I used you. And I allowed it, Alexander said simply, because I was using you too. I needed to know if authentic emotion could develop from artificial circumstances. Congratulations, my dear. You've proven that it can. So what happens now? Victoria asked, her voice trembling. Do you divorce me? Expose me? Destroy my family financially? Alexander's smile returned, but this time it held an edge that made Victoria's blood run cold. Now, my dear wife, we enter the truly interesting phase of our relationship. You see, proving that you could develop real feelings was only the first part of my experiment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a thick folder that Victoria had never seen before. The second part is much more complex. It involves seeing just how far someone will go to protect the people they love when they realize they're trapped in a web much more intricate than they ever imagined. Victoria's heart pounded as Alexander opened the folder, revealing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. You wanted my inheritance, Victoria, but I'm afraid the cost of claiming it is going to be much higher than you ever anticipated. You see, inheriting from Alexander Blackwood requires passing a series of, shall we call them, challenges? And failure isn't just about losing money. It's about losing everything you've worked so hard to protect. As Victoria stared at the contents of the folder, she realized that marrying Alexander Blackwood hadn't been her salvation. It had been the beginning of a game she never knew she was playing, with rules she was only now beginning to understand. The morning after Alexander's revelation, Victoria woke in her luxurious bedroom, feeling like a stranger in her own life. Everything looked the same, the silk curtains, the antique vanity, the fresh roses Mrs. Chun arranged daily, but nothing felt real anymore. She was no longer Victoria Sterling, the desperate young woman who had married for money. She was a test subject in Alexander's elaborate psychological experiment. At breakfast, Alexander greeted her with the same warm smile he'd worn for 18 months. But now Victoria saw calculation behind his eyes. Every gesture, every kind word, every tender moment, had any of it been genuine? Good morning, my dear, he said, buttering his toast with practiced elegance. I trust you slept well after our enlightening conversation? Victoria forced herself to eat, though the expensive organic fruit tasted like ash. Alexander, those documents you showed me last night, what exactly do they contain? Patience, Victoria. All will be revealed in due time. For now, I have some business calls to make. He stood, straightening his Italian silk tie. But do take some time to explore the estate today. There are areas I'm certain you haven't discovered yet. After Alexander left for his office, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She was no longer going to be a passive participant in whatever game he was playing. If Alexander wanted to study her like a lab rat, She would conduct her own investigation. She started with Alexander's private study, a room she had always respected as off-limits. Using the housekeeper's master key, Mrs. Chun had left it unguarded while preparing lunch. Victoria slipped inside. The study was a monument to Alexander's success. Awards, patents, photographs with presidents and tech moguls. But hidden behind a false panel she discovered while examining a bookshelf, Victoria found something that made her blood run cold. Wall covered with photographs of her dot, not just recent photos from their marriage, but pictures dating back years. Victoria at her college graduation. Victoria at her part-time jobs. Victoria visiting her mother in the hospital. Victoria at the art gallery the night before they accidentally met. Her hands shook as she realized the truth. Their meeting hadn't been chance. Alexander had been watching her, studying her, planning their encounter for months, maybe years. Among the photographs, Victoria found a detailed dossier with her psychological profile, financial records, and even transcripts of her private phone conversations. A sticky note in Alexander's handwriting read, "Perfect candidate, high emotional intelligence, strong family loyalty, desperate enough to consider drastic measures." But the most chilling discovery was a leather journal filled with Alexander's observations about their relationship. Day 47. Subject shows genuine distress when I feign illness. Protective instincts emerging faster than predicted. Day 156. Subject's guilt responses suggest authentic emotional attachment forming. Phase 2 can begin soon. Day 298. Subject demonstrates clear internal conflict. Ready for confession scenario. Victoria realized with horror that Alexander had been manipulating every aspect of their relationship, orchestrating situations to evoke specific emotional responses. The time he had gotten lost during a walk, causing her to frantically search for him. Planned the romantic dinner where he'd spoken so vulnerably about missing his late wife. Scripted. As Victoria delved deeper into the house's secrets, she began noticing things she had previously overlooked. The staff, Mrs. Chun, the gardener Miguel, even the night security guard, all watched her with a mixture of pity and apprehension. They knew something she didn't. During lunch, Victoria cornered Mrs. Chun in the kitchen. "How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwood?" 15 years, Mrs. Blackwood, Mrs. Chun replied, avoiding eye contact. "Have there been other wives?" Mrs. Chun's hand stilled on the dish she was washing. "No, ma'am. You are the only one Mr. Alexander married since Mrs. Margaret passed. But there have been other women, haven't there? Other experiments?" The older woman's silence was answer enough. Finally, Mrs. Chun whispered, "Some things are better left unknown. Mrs. Blackwood, some questions should not be asked." That evening, Victoria discovered Alexander's computer password by watching his finger movements from the hallway mirror's reflection. Inside his encrypted files, she found videos labeled Project Renaissance, recordings of other young women who had been brought to the estate under various pretenses. There was Sarah, a struggling medical student who had been offered a research grant. Alina, an artist who had been promised gallery representation. Melissa, a young lawyer who had been offered a position at Alexander's legal firm. All of them were desperate. All of them had been carefully selected and monitored. The videos showed their gradual realization that they were trapped in situations far more complex than they had understood. Some had tried to leave and been prevented by legal complications. Others had simply disappeared from the recordings with no explanation of what had happened to them. As Victoria watched the footage, a terrifying pattern emerged. Alexander wasn't just studying human behavior, he was collecting data on how far people would go when pushed to their psychological limits. Each woman had been presented with increasingly difficult moral choices, forced to compromise their values to protect something they loved. The final video was dated just 3 months before Victoria and Alexander had met at the gallery. It showed a young woman named Catherine who looked remarkably similar to Victoria's same age. Same desperate circumstances, same psychological profile. In the final recording, Catherine was begging Alexander for mercy, promising to do anything he asked if he would just let her family go. The recording ended abruptly. Victoria's hands trembled as she realized the truth. She wasn't Alexander's first psychological experiment. She was just the latest in a long line of carefully selected subjects. And if the pattern held true, her real test was only beginning. Victoria spent the night poring over the documents from Alexander's computer, each discovery more horrifying than the last. At 3 a.m., she found something that made her blood freeze, a business contract dated 15 years ago between Blackwood Tech Industries and Sterling Biomedical Research, her father's company. Dr. James Sterling, her father, had been Alexander's business partner in developing revolutionary cancer treatment technology. The same technology that could have saved her mother's life if it hadn't been deliberately suppressed. Victoria's hands shook as she read the contract termination papers. Alexander had bought out her father's share of the company for a fraction of its worth, then shelved the cancer treatment research to focus on more profitable ventures. Her father had died 3 years later, broken and financially ruined, never knowing his life's work could have saved millions of lives, including his wife's. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Alexander hadn't chosen Victoria randomly. She was the daughter of the man he had destroyed. This wasn't just a psychological experiment. It was the ultimate act of revenge. He had systematically destroyed her father's legacy, then orchestrated her mother's suffering by ensuring the cancer treatment remained unavailable, and finally lured Victoria herself into his web. But the documents revealed something even more sinister. Alexander's Project Renaissance wasn't about studying human behavior. It was about creating the perfect victim. Each woman he had brought to the estate had been connected to someone who had wronged him in business. Sarah's father had been a competitor who had stolen clients. Elena's brother had been a journalist who exposed Blackwood Tech's questionable practices. Melissa's family owned land that Alexander wanted for expansion. Victoria was his masterpiece, the daughter of his former partner, manipulated into marrying him, then slowly psychologically destroyed as the ultimate revenge against a dead man. When Alexander returned from his business trip the next evening, Victoria was waiting in his study, the evidence spread across his desk like accusations. Her fear had transformed into cold fury. "Welcome home, darling," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've been reading some fascinating bedtime stories." Alexander paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. For the first time since she'd known him, his composure cracked slightly. "Victoria, I can explain. Can you?" She stood, holding up the contract that had destroyed her father. "Can you explain how you systematically destroyed my family? How you condemned my mother to death by suppressing the treatment that could have saved her? How you turned me into your psychological plaything as the ultimate act of revenge against a dead man?" Alexander's mask finally fell away completely. The gentle, loving husband disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Your father was a weak man who lacked vision. His idealistic notions about making treatments affordable would have bankrupted us both, so you destroyed him instead. I made a business decision." Alexander moved into the room, his presence suddenly menacing. James Sterling was too naive for the pharmaceutical industry. He would have given away billions of dollars in research for free, all in the name of helping humanity. Victoria felt her world tilt as Alexander's true nature fully revealed itself. And the other women? Sarah, Elena, Melissa, Catherine. What happened to them? Alexander's smile returned, but now it was predatory. They served their purpose. Some learned to accept their roles. Others required more permanent solutions to maintain their silence. The threat in his words was unmistakable. Victoria realized with growing horror that she wasn't just trapped in a psychological experiment, she was in genuine physical danger. "You're a monster," she whispered. "I'm a businessman," Alexander corrected. "And you, my dear Victoria, are my greatest success story. Your father's brilliant daughter, reduced to a gold-digging wife, slowly being driven insane by the truth of what she's become. It's poetic justice. But here's what makes you special, Victoria," Alexander continued, moving closer. "You're not just another experiment. You're the finale. Once I break you completely, once you either submit entirely or have a very tragic accident, I'll release the cancer treatment your father developed. The world will remember James Sterling as the brilliant scientist whose work finally saw the light, thanks to the generosity of Alexander Blackwood. Your father's legacy will belong to me." Victoria backed against the wall, understanding finally that there was no escape Alexander had planned for her. "The inheritance you promised, it was never real, was it?" "Oh, it's real," Alexander said. "But the only way you'll inherit anything is if you play by my rules completely. Become the perfect, obedient wife who never questions, never investigates, never remembers what she's learned. Forget about your father, your mother, everything that came before. Live only for my pleasure and approval. And if I refuse?" Alexander's eyes glittered with malice. "Then you'll join Catherine and the others who couldn't adapt. A tragic accident, perhaps. A young woman overcome by guilt about marrying for money, who took her own life in despair. Very sad, very believable." Victoria realized she was standing at a crossroads that would determine not just her fate, but the fate of every future victim Alexander might target. She could submit and live as his psychological prisoner, or she could fight back and risk everything. "You've made one crucial mistake, Alexander," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "And what's that, my dear?" "You assumed I was as weak as my father." Victoria pulled out her phone, showing him the recording app that had been running throughout their conversation. "But I'm not just James Sterling's daughter. I'm also my mother's child. And she taught me that sometimes you have to fight monsters, even when you're terrified." For the first time, Alexander looked genuinely surprised. The game had just changed, and Victoria was no longer playing by his rules. Alexander's surprise quickly transformed into rage. "You naive little girl. Do you really think a recording will save you? I have lawyers, judges, politicians in my pocket. Who's going to believe the word of a gold-digging wife against a respected billionaire philanthropist?" But Victoria had learned from watching Alexander's own methodical approach. "You're right about one thing I did learn from you. While you were busy gloating about your master plan, I wasn't just recording our conversation." She pulled out a second phone, showing him a live stream notification. "I've been broadcasting everything to Marcus, my brother, and 3 of his computer science friends. The recording is already uploaded to multiple cloud servers, and copies have been automatically sent to the FBI, the SEC, and 5 major news outlets." Alexander's face went white. "You're bluffing. Marcus may be young, but he's brilliant with technology. Amazing what you can accomplish when your sister texts you a detailed plan at 3 a.m. and asks you to set up emergency protocols." Victoria's voice grew stronger with each word. "I also sent him all the files from your computer, including the evidence about my father's stolen research and the other women you've destroyed." The sound of sirens in the distance made Alexander's composure crumble completely. "You don't understand what you've done. Those cancer treatments, I was going to release them eventually. I'm not a monster, I'm a businessman protecting my investments. By murdering innocent women, by condemning cancer patients to death while you sat on the cure." Victoria stood her ground as police sirens grew louder. "You want to know the difference between you and my father? He believed some things were more important than money. You've never learned that lesson." Alexander lunged toward her, but Victoria was ready. She pressed a panic button on the security system, a feature she discovered during her investigation. Steel shutters slammed down over the windows, and the study door automatically locked, trapping them both inside until police could arrive. Clever. Girl, Alexander snarled. But even if they arrest me, you'll never see a penny of my money. I've made sure of that. I don't want your money, Victoria replied. I never did. I wanted to save my family, but not at the cost of my soul. Within an hour, the estate was swarming with FBI agents and investigators. The evidence Victoria and Marcus had compiled was overwhelming. Financial records showing Alexander's systematic destruction of business partners, encrypted files detailing his psychological experiments, and most damning of all, recorded confessions of multiple murders disguised as accidents. As Alexander was led away in handcuffs, he turned to Victoria one last time. You think you've won? You've just destroyed the fortune that could have secured your family's future forever. No, Victoria sighed quietly. I've just ensured that other families won't suffer the way mine did. The investigation that followed exposed the full scope of Alexander's crimes. 7 women had been victimized over the past 5 years. 3 had submitted to his psychological control and were found alive, traumatized but recovering insecure. Locations: 4, including Catherine, had been murdered when they attempted to expose him or escape. The trial lasted 6 months. Victoria testified about Alexander's systematic manipulation and the evidence she had uncovered. Her courage in speaking out inspired other victims of corporate abuse to come forward, leading to a broader investigation into corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. Alexander Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison without parole for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. His assets were frozen and eventually liquidated to compensate his victims and their families. Victoria's greatest victory came when the court ordered the immediate release of her father's cancer treatment research. The technology that Alexander had suppressed for 15 years finally reached the medical community, where it began saving lives within months. Standing in the courthouse steps after the sentencing, Victoria felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying her entire adult life. Marcus joined her, along with their mother, who had begun responding well to the new cancer treatment derived from their father's work. What now? Marcus asked. Victoria looked back at the courthouse where justice had finally been served. Now we make sure Dad's work reaches everyone who needs it. I'm starting a foundation, the James Sterling Medical Research Foundation, to ensure that life-saving treatments are never hidden from the public again. 6 months later, Victoria stood in the modest offices of her new foundation, surrounded by medical researchers, patient advocates, and survivors whose lives had been saved by her father's work. The foundation had grown rapidly, funded by donations from people who believed in accessible healthcare. Mrs. Chen, Alexander's former housekeeper, had asked to work for the foundation. Mrs. Blackwood, she said one afternoon, I want you to know, in all my years working for him, you were the first person who wasn't afraid to fight back. You saved more than just yourself. Victoria smiled, looking at a framed photo of her parents on her desk. I learned something important from all this. The real inheritance isn't money, it's the courage to do what's right, even when it costs everything. As Victoria locked up the foundation offices that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had entered Alexander's world as a desperate young woman, willing to compromise her values for financial security. She was leaving it as someone who understood that true wealth came from protecting others and honoring the legacy of those who came before. Her phone buzzed with a text from a patient whose life had been saved by her father's research. Thank you for making sure the treatment was available. My daughter will grow up with her mother because of your courage. Victoria walked into the sunset, knowing that sometimes the greatest inheritance we can receive is the strength to transform our deepest pain into our most meaningful purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.